Silence, not the kind that brings relief, and not the quiet that follows safety. This silence had weight. It settled into the lungs, lingered in the mind, and refused to explain itself. For thousands of German soldiers captured during the Second World War and transported across the Atlantic, silence was the first thing that felt wrong. There were no shouted threats when they disembarked, no blows meant to establish dominance, no humiliating rituals designed to strip them of identity. Instead, there were forms to fill, lines to stand in, numbers assigned, and rules calmly explained. The absence of cruelty was not comforting. It was disorienting. These men had prepared themselves for pain. They had not prepared themselves for nothing. From the moment a German soldier entered military service, he was conditioned to believe that capture by the enemy was a fate worse than death. This idea was not subtle. It was repeated endlessly through speeches, pamphlets, training manuals, and battlefield rumors. The enemy, especially the Americans, were depicted as undisciplined brutes hiding behind industrial excess. They were portrayed as men without honor, incapable of understanding sacrifice, who compensated for moral weakness with sadism. Surrender meant torture. It meant public humiliation. It meant slow destruction of both body and spirit. This belief was not simply propaganda. It became a psychological framework that shaped how soldiers interpreted reality itself. As the war dragged on and Germany's situation deteriorated, this fear intensified. Soldiers retreating across Europe heard stories, some real, many exaggerated, about what happened to those who fell into enemy hands. These stories spread faster than facts ever could. They were whispered in trenches, passed between units, and reinforced by officers who needed their men to fight to the last possible moment. Better to die on the battlefield, they were told, than to live as a prisoner of the enemy. And many believed it. Some fought until they were overwhelmed. Others destroyed their weapons and waited for death. A few chose suicide over surrender. Those who survived capture carried with them a deep certainty that suffering was inevitable. The journey to the United States only sharpened this expectation. Packed into transport ships, guarded closely, cut off from the familiar landscape of Europe, the prisoners imagined what awaited them on the other side of the ocean. Interrogation chambers, beatings, revenge for bombed cities and dead civilians. They imagined guards eager to extract punishment rather than information. Yet when they arrived, the process unfolded with a precision that felt almost bureaucratic. Names were recorded, personal belongings cataloged, medical checks conducted, barracks assigned. Everything was orderly, efficient, and impersonal. No one seemed angry. No one seemed interested in vengeance. That calm was deeply unsettling. The camps themselves reinforced this strange contradiction. These were not places of freedom. Movement was controlled. Schedules were rigid. Discipline was enforced. But there was food, regular meals, enough calories to sustain health. There was medical care for wounds and illnesses. There were inspections, but not random violence. Guards carried weapons, but they did not brandish them unnecessarily. Orders were given clearly and followed by predictable consequences. For men who had spent years living under constant threat of death, this predictability was foreign. It removed the familiar rhythm of fear and replaced it with something far more difficult to process. The true shock did not come from physical conditions, but from the psychological environment. The absence of brutality forced these prisoners to confront a reality that contradicted everything they had been taught. If the enemy was supposed to be savage, why maintain order? If Americans were supposed to be morally inferior, why adhere to international rules of conduct? These questions did not arrive all at once. They crept in slowly during long hours of inactivity, during nights when there was nothing to do but think. Silence does that. It strips away distraction and leaves the mind alone with itself. For many prisoners, the early weeks were spent waiting, waiting for the beatings to start, waiting for interrogations that never came, waiting for the mask to drop. Some interpreted the calm as deception, a temporary phase before real punishment began. Others suspected that the Americans were playing a psychological game, withholding cruelty to make it more effective later. But days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, and the silence remained. It was not benevolent. It was not cruel. It was simply constant. And over time, it became impossible to ignore what it represented. To understand why this silence was so powerful, it is necessary to understand the identity these men carried into captivity. They were not just soldiers in uniform, they were participants in a system that demanded absolute loyalty and promised absolute meaning in return. The state provided a clear narrative. Germany was strong, righteous, and surrounded by enemies. Sacrifice was noble. Obedience was virtue. Doubt was weakness. War was not merely a conflict over territory, but a test of ideological truth. As long as the war continued, this worldview remained intact. Every battle reinforced it. Every loss could be justified as temporary. Every death could be framed as necessary. Captivity removed that structure entirely. There was no front line, no heroic struggle, no immediate purpose beyond survival. The routines of camp life were repetitive and monotonous. Wake up, roll call, meals, work details, sleep. Day after day, the same sequence repeated. Without the constant reinforcement of ideology through action, belief began to erode. The silence between events grew louder. Men started to remember things they had avoided thinking about. Friends who had disappeared. Orders that no longer made sense. Civilians caught in the path of retreat. These memories did not arrive as clear moral judgments. They arrived as discomfort. Some prisoners attempted to resist this psychological drift. They recreated military hierarchies within the camps, enforcing discipline and ideological conformity among themselves. Officers held informal meetings. Symbols of loyalty were maintained. Those who questioned the old beliefs were pressured into silence. In some cases, intimidation and violence were used to keep doubt contained, but this internal control was fragile. It depended on constant effort, and the environment did not support it. Without an external enemy to fight, maintaining absolute conviction became exhausting. What made the situation even more destabilizing was that the Americans did not interfere. They did not attempt to openly re-educate or humiliate. They did not force ideological debates. They simply maintained order and let time do its work. The silence became a space where questions could not be easily suppressed. Every uneventful day weakened the idea that the world was divided cleanly into good and evil. Every act of routine fairness chipped away at the image of the enemy as a monster. Slowly, often unwillingly, many prisoners began to realize that the greatest threat they faced was not physical suffering, but internal collapse. The silence was exposing contradictions they could no longer ignore. It was not punishing them. It was confronting them. And in that confrontation, something far more unsettling than torture began to take shape. The possibility that everything they had believed, everything they had sacrificed for, might not have been true. That realization did not arrive like a revelation. It did not strike in a single moment of clarity. It spread slowly, unevenly, like a crack creeping through thick ice. At first, most prisoners resisted it. They told themselves that this calm was temporary, that the war would soon turn, that Germany would recover, that their captivity would be brief. Hope, even false hope, served as insulation against doubt. But time in these camps did not move the way time moved at the front. There were no dramatic events to mark progress, no victories or defeats to frame the days. Time flattened, weeks blurred together, and in that flatness, certainty began to erode. Work details played a critical role in this process. Many German prisoners were assigned to labor outside the camps, often on farms and factories or on infrastructure projects. This was not forced labor in the sense they had imagined. It was regulated, paid in camp credits, and monitored under the rules of the Geneva Convention. For men who expected chains and whips, being handed tools and instructions was another cognitive shock. They worked alongside civilians. They heard American accents not filtered through propaganda, but through casual conversation. They saw ordinary lives continuing far from the front lines. This exposure was not dramatic, but it was corrosive to rigid belief systems. American civilians were not supposed to exist like this. According to the worldview these prisoners had carried with them, the enemy population was decadent, morally bankrupt, and weakened by comfort. Yet the farmers they met woke before dawn, worked until exhaustion, and treated them with a detached practicality that lacked hatred. Some were cold, some were indifferent, a few were openly hostile, But many were simply curious. They asked questions about Europe, about cities they had only heard of in newspapers. They did not behave like conquerors savoring revenge. They behaved like people trying to get through their day. This was deeply unsettling. Hatred is easier to sustain when the enemy is abstract. When it becomes personal, when it acquires a face and a routine, hatred requires effort. Some prisoners responded by retreating inward, avoiding interaction whenever possible. Others leaned into ideological rigidity, interpreting any kindness as weakness or manipulation. But for many, repeated exposure wore down resistance. They began to notice inconsistencies between what they had been told and what they were seeing. These inconsistencies accumulated quietly, without announcement, without drama. Inside the camps, this internal tension manifested in subtle ways. Conversations became cautious. Certain topics were avoided. Men who had once spoken confidently about victory now spoke in conditional language. Rumors replaced proclamations. News from Europe filtered in slowly and often incompletely, but even fragmented information carried weight. Cities bombed, fronts collapsing, allies advancing. Each piece of news chipped away at the assumption that surrender had been a mistake. If Germany was losing, then survival itself became meaningful. And if survival mattered, then captivity was no longer simply a disgrace. It was a continuation. This shift created fractures among the prisoners. Not everyone adapted at the same pace. Hardliners accused others of weakness. Informal courts were established to punish those seen as disloyal. In extreme cases, intimidation escalated into violence. These internal conflicts reveal something important. The most intense pressure within the camps often came not from American guards, but from fellow prisoners. The old system was trying to sustain itself in a space where its foundations no longer held. Silence gave room for dissent, and dissent threatened identity. The American authorities were aware of this dynamic, but their response was calculatedly minimal. They enforced camp rules, intervened when violence occurred, but avoided heavy-handed ideological confrontation. Instead, they introduced controlled access to information, newspapers, radio broadcasts, carefully selected films. These materials were not framed as propaganda. They were presented as news, as entertainment, as normal cultural output. This distinction mattered. Direct confrontation invites resistance. Indirect exposure invites comparison. And comparison is far more dangerous to absolute belief than argument. For many prisoners, hearing uncensored news about the war was a turning point. Reports from neutral sources, confirmation of defeats that could no longer be dismissed as exaggeration, eroded the remaining scaffolding of certainty. The realization that the narrative they had trusted was incomplete, or worse, deliberately false, did not produce immediate rejection. It produced confusion. Confusion is destabilizing. It creates a vacuum where new interpretations begin to form, often unconsciously. This is where the silence returned as the dominant force. Not the silence of isolation, but the silence between belief and replacement. The old worldview was weakening, but no new framework had fully taken its place. Many prisoners experienced this as anxiety rather than clarity. Nighttime was particularly difficult. Without tasks to occupy their attention, thoughts wandered. Regret surfaced. So did guilt, though not always in explicit moral terms. It appeared as restlessness, irritability, and a sense of dislocation. The men they had been before capture felt distant, almost fictional. It is important to understand that this process was not universal, nor was it uniform. Some prisoners never questioned their beliefs. Some remained ideologically committed until the end of the war and beyond. But even among them, the environment imposed strain. Maintaining certainty required constant reinforcement, and the camp offered none. Silence does not argue, but it waits, and waiting favors doubt. Midway through this long psychological unraveling, a strange realization began to surface among many prisoners. They were being treated not as symbols, but as individuals. This was not kindness in the sentimental sense. It was procedural, legal, predictable, yet it stood in sharp contrast to the collectivist logic they had lived under. They were no longer interchangeable units in a vast ideological machine. Their names mattered. Their health mattered. Their behavior produced specific consequences rather than collective punishment. This individualization was subtle but transformative. And this is the moment where I want to pause the story briefly and ask you something. As you listen to this, consider how you would react in the same position. If everything you believed about the world began to quietly contradict itself, without confrontation, without violence, would you notice it happening? Or would it take time? If this kind of psychological unraveling interests you, take a second to leave a comment with your thoughts. And if you're finding value here, a like and a subscription help keep stories like this alive. The longer the captivity lasted, the clearer it became that the Americans were not trying to break these men through force. They were allowing circumstances to do that work instead. The routine, the fairness, the exposure to alternative realities all functioned together as a slow pressure. Not enough to cause open collapse, but enough to prevent reconstruction of the old certainty. This approach was not accidental. It reflected a deeper confidence that systems built on coercion struggle to survive in environments governed by consistency and time. By the later stages of the war, some prisoners had begun to articulate something they would not have dared to say earlier. They spoke quietly about relief, relief at being alive, relief at no longer having to pretend certainty in the face of chaos. This did not mean admiration for the enemy, nor did it erase loyalty to their homeland. It meant that survival had regained its own legitimacy. Life was no longer valuable only as a tool of ideology. It had value in itself. This shift, however, came with a cost. When news of Germany's impending defeat became unavoidable, the question of return loomed over the camps. Going home no longer meant resuming a familiar identity. It meant confronting a world that had been fundamentally altered. Cities destroyed, families displaced or dead. A nation forced to reckon with the consequences of its actions. For some prisoners, captivity had become a buffer zone between two realities. Leaving it meant facing judgment, both external and internal. As the silence continued, it transformed from an absence into a presence. It was no longer merely what the Americans did not do. It became the space in which these men were forced to encounter themselves without the armor of slogans or uniforms. And for many, that encounter was far more difficult than any punishment they had imagined. As the months stretched on and the war in Europe moved toward its unavoidable conclusion, the silence inside the camps began to take on a new quality. It was no longer just the absence of violence or the absence of interrogation. It became a mirror, a space where nothing distracted from the slow unraveling already underway. For many prisoners, this phase was more difficult than the early shock of capture. At least fear had been familiar. Uncertainty was not. By early 1945, it was becoming harder to sustain the belief that captivity was a temporary interruption. News arrived unevenly, but the direction was unmistakable. German forces were collapsing on multiple fronts. Cities that had once been symbols of permanence were now reduced to names followed by the word destroyed. Even the most optimistic interpretations could no longer support the fantasy of reversal. The war was ending, and it was ending badly. Inside the camps, reactions varied. Some men clung to denial, dismissing reports as exaggeration or enemy propaganda. Others reacted with a strange detachment, as if the outcome had already been emotionally processed long before confirmation arrived. For a significant number, however, the realization triggered a deeper crisis, one that had little to do with politics and everything to do with identity. If Germany was defeated, then what did that make them? They had been trained to see themselves as instruments of a historical mission. Individual suffering was irrelevant in the face of national destiny. Victory justified everything. Defeat negated nothing as long as belief remained intact. But now defeat was not theoretical. It was imminent, observable, and irreversible. The ideology that had framed their lives offered no guidance for what came next. It had been built for struggle, not for aftermath. This is where the silence became suffocating. Without the constant reinforcement of purpose, many prisoners began to experience a form of psychological freefall. There was no longer a narrative pushing them forward, no command structure demanding emotional alignment. Days continued to follow the same routine, but internally something was shifting. Thoughts that had once been dismissed as weakness now returned with persistence. Questions once considered dangerous now surfaced without invitation. What had it all been for? What exactly had they been defending? And what would remain when they went home? The idea of home itself had become unstable. Letters from Germany, when they arrived at all, painted a picture that felt unreal. Entire neighborhoods erased, food rationing reduced to desperation, families fragmented by death, displacement, or silence. For some prisoners, captivity had insulated them from the worst physical consequences of defeat. That realization carried its own burden. Survival began to feel less like fortune and more like obligation. The Americans, for their part, did not alter their behavior as victory approached. There were no triumphalist displays, no shift toward humiliation. The camps continued to operate under the same procedures. Meals were served, rules were enforced, medical care continued. This consistency was striking. The system did not react emotionally to the collapse of its enemy. It simply absorbed the outcome and moved on. For men accustomed to a political culture built on spectacle and intensity, this emotional neutrality was profoundly destabilizing. Victory and defeat had always been framed as moral events, charged with meaning and symbolism. Here they were logistical facts. Paperwork changed, schedules adjusted, nothing else did. In this environment, reflection became unavoidable. Some prisoners began to talk, not loudly, not publicly, but in cautious, fragmented conversations. These were not confessions. They were not ideological reversals. They were expressions of uncertainty. Men admitted they no longer knew what they believed. Others acknowledged exhaustion, not just physical, but moral. A few spoke of shame, though rarely in explicit terms. It appeared instead as discomfort when recalling certain orders, certain moments, certain silences of their own. Importantly, this process did not unfold under pressure from the guards. The Americans did not demand introspection. They did not interrogate belief. The conversations happened because there was space for them to happen. Silence creates room, and room invites thought. Not everyone welcomed this. Ideological hardliners intensified their efforts to maintain discipline within the prisoner population. Informal hierarchies persisted. Loyalty was monitored. Those who appeared too accommodating or reflective were sometimes accused of betrayal. In extreme cases, intimidation escalated into violence. These internal conflicts revealed a crucial truth. The strongest resistance to psychological change came not from captivity itself, but from the remnants of the old system struggling to survive inside it. American authorities were aware of these dynamics. When conflicts crossed certain thresholds, they intervened. But for the most part, they avoided heavy-handed involvement. Their strategy remained indirect. Information continued to be introduced gradually. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, films, carefully selected, but not aggressively framed. The goal was not confrontation, but exposure. Exposure is subtle. It does not demand agreement. It simply presents alternatives. For many prisoners, access to uncensored information was more disruptive than any interrogation could have been. Reports from neutral or allied sources confirmed what rumors had hinted at. Defeats were not isolated incidents. They were systemic. The narrative of inevitability collapsed. And once inevitability disappears, justification becomes fragile. This produced confusion rather than clarity. Confusion is uncomfortable. It creates psychological instability. Without a clear replacement for the old worldview, many prisoners found themselves suspended between belief and disbelief. The silence between those states was deeply unsettling. It was not filled with answers. It was filled with waiting. As the war officially ended, the question of repatriation dominated camp life. When would they be sent home? What would happen when they arrived? What kind of reception awaited them? These questions carried emotional weight far beyond logistics. Returning meant facing accountability, not necessarily legal, but existential. The distance provided by captivity had allowed for reflection without immediate consequence. Home would not offer that buffer. Repatriation was slow. Transportation networks were damaged. Political arrangements were complex. Many prisoners remained in the United States for months after Germany's surrender. This extended period intensified the transformation already underway. The longer they stayed, the more distant their former identities felt. Soldierhood, once central, now seemed abstract. The war had ended without them. History had moved on. Some prisoners began to notice a strange reversal in their emotional state. Early captivity had been defined by fear of mistreatment. Late captivity was defined by fear of release. The camps, once imagined as sites of suffering, had become spaces of psychological suspension. Leaving them meant stepping into a world that demanded interpretation and responsibility. The journey back across the Atlantic reversed the physical trajectory of capture, but not the psychological one. Many prisoners carried the silence with them. It had become internalized. They had learned to live without constant ideological noise, without slogans dictating meaning. That absence could not be easily undone. Upon return, reality confirmed their unease. Germany was not just defeated, it was disoriented. Institutions had collapsed. Moral authority was fragmented. Public narratives were unstable. For former prisoners, reintegration was uneven. Some attempted to resume normal life as quickly as possible, avoiding reflection. Others struggled with alienation, unable to reconcile past belief with present reality. In retrospect, many would identify captivity as a turning point, not because of what happened, but because of what did not happen. There had been no systematic brutality, no enforced humiliation. Instead, there had been time, structure, silence. These elements combined to strip belief of urgency. Without urgency, belief weakened. This is the uncomfortable lesson at the center of this story. The Americans did not need to destroy their prisoners' ideology through force. They allowed it to decay under conditions where it was no longer required for survival. They demonstrated that systems built on coercion depend on constant reinforcement. Remove the pressure, and the structure begins to collapse under its own contradictions. They expected torture. What they got was silence. And that silence did something far more enduring. It forced thousands of men to confront the difference between obedience and conviction, between survival and meaning. It revealed how deeply environment shapes belief and how fragile belief becomes when its supporting structures disappear. If this story made you reflect on how identity, power, and silence interact in moments of collapse, share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more deeply human stories like this, consider liking the video and subscribing. It helps keep these histories alive and gives space for the silence to speak.